Think back to where you were on February 24th, 2022, the day Russia invaded Ukraine. Most people saw it on the news, shook their heads, and said, "That's terrible, but it's happening somewhere else." And then they went back to their lives. That idea that it's somewhere else is the most dangerous assumption you can make right now. Because what I'm about to show you, step by step, is that the conflicts happening across the world today are not isolated events. They are connected, like dominoes. And some of those dominoes have already started to fall. This isn't about fear, it's about seeing the map. Because once you understand the map, you stop reacting blindly and you start understanding what's actually unfolding. Let's start with reality. The world right now is not in a normal state. We are looking at simultaneous conflicts across multiple regions: Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, the Sahel, and the Middle East, all active at the same time. This is not coincidence. This is pressure building across the system. And here's a number that should make you pause. In January 2026, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the organization that created the doomsday clock during the Cold War, set that clock to 89 seconds to midnight. 89 seconds. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war, that clock stood at 7 minutes. Today, we are closer to catastrophic escalation than at any point in that era, and that is not a metaphor. It is a measured assessment. At the same time, global military spending reached $2.7 trillion in 2024, rising 9.4% in a single year, the sharpest increase since the Cold War ended. And the most important detail is this: the world's 15 largest military spenders all increased their budgets. Every single one. Countries do not behave like that when they feel secure. They do it when they are preparing. So the real question is no longer whether something is happening. The real question is, what exactly is building beneath the surface right now? Here's what that something actually is. The first domino is the Strait of Hormuz. Most people have never heard of it, but this narrow stretch of water, just 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, is one of the most critical pieces of geography on Earth right now. Around 20% of the world's oil flows through this single corridor every day, roughly 20 million barrels, feeding economies that have no immediate alternative. India depends on it for about 60% of its energy. China, around 40%. Japan, roughly 75%. And Japan's own leadership has said it openly: if this corridor closes, even temporarily, the country runs out of oil within months and the economy begins to break down. That's how fragile this system really is. And right now, that pressure is no longer theoretical. Shipping traffic through Hormuz has already dropped significantly, and the cost of ensuring vessels moving through the region has surged in a matter of weeks. Oil prices have reacted immediately, with Brent crude jumping sharply from pre-conflict levels and pushing past $110 a barrel. Natural gas prices in Europe have surged as well, rising by nearly 60%. Fertilizer, the input that determines how much food can be produced, has climbed by more than 30%. And this is where people start to feel it, whether they realize it or not. Because this is no longer a foreign policy issue. This is your cost of living, your heating bill, your grocery bill. And that connection between energy and food is where the situation becomes much more serious than most people expect. The Gulf states, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, import the vast majority of their food, in some cases up to 80%. Kuwait relies on desalination for about 90% of its drinking water. Saudi Arabia, around 70%. Across the region, hundreds of desalination plants produce a massive share of the world's freshwater supply, supporting tens of millions of people. And all of that infrastructure depends on stable energy and stable logistics. Iran understands this, and the strategy is not to win a direct, conventional war against a stronger opponent. That's not the objective. The objective is to apply pressure where the system is most vulnerable: energy infrastructure, shipping routes, desalination plants, and supply chains. And this is where the math becomes uncomfortable. Iran is capable of producing large numbers of low-cost drones every single day, with each unit costing tens of thousands of dollars. The defensive systems used to intercept them, on the other hand, can cost close to $1 million per missile. That gap doesn't just exist, it compounds over time. Every interception becomes a financial loss. Every wave becomes harder to sustain. And at scale, the imbalance becomes unsustainable. This is not about a single strike. It's about repetition. Pressure applied continuously until the system starts to give. and we are already seeing early signs of that pressure feeding into the global system. The World Food Program has issued warnings that rising fuel and transport costs are beginning to ripple through global food markets, increasing prices even in regions far removed from the conflict itself, which means the impact of this situation is no longer contained. It has already begun to spread. Step 2 is the nuclear question, and this is where people usually stop paying attention, because the default assumption is simple: nobody would actually use nuclear weapons. But that assumption is exactly what makes this stage so dangerous. Because the risk here is not intention, it's escalation. According to the U.S. intelligence community's 2026 threat assessment, the most serious danger posed by Russia is not just conventional war, but an escalatory spiral that could lead to direct conflict with nuclear dimensions. Russia operates under a doctrine often described as escalate to de-escalate. The idea is not to win a nuclear war, but to use a limited nuclear strike to force the opponent to back down and end the conflict on Russian terms. It is not irrational, it is calculated, and we have already seen actions that move in that direction. In June 2025, Ukraine launched drone strikes targeting Russian strategic bombers near critical nuclear infrastructure. Analysts describe this as one of the most destabilizing moves in recent years because it directly touched systems linked to nuclear delivery capability. In response, nuclear signaling intensified across multiple actors. France and the United Kingdom publicly stated that their nuclear forces could be coordinated in response to extreme threats in Europe. The United States deployed nuclear-capable submarines to the region following rising tensions. At the same time, North Korea expanded its involvement, sending thousands of troops and technical personnel while continuing to develop advanced missile systems, including hypersonic capabilities and nuclear-powered platforms. At this point, this is no longer a contained regional conflict. It is a multi-actor system with nuclear-armed states operating in overlapping theaters. And that creates the most dangerous condition of all. Not a planned nuclear exchange, but the possibility of miscalculation. Because when multiple actors are moving simultaneously, each responding to perceived threats, each operating under different doctrines, the margin for error begins to shrink. And once that margin disappears, events no longer unfold based on intention. They unfold based on reaction. Step 3 is Taiwan, the variable that most people prefer not to think about, because it sits outside the current headlines, but not outside the system. While conflicts continue in Europe and the Middle East, China has been observing, adjusting, and preparing. According to the Pentagon's 2025 assessment of China's military capabilities, Beijing is working toward the ability to fight and win a conflict over Taiwan by the end of 2027. That is not speculation, it is a stated planning benchmark, and the activity on the ground reflects that direction. In 2025 alone, Chinese aircraft conducted thousands of incursions into Taiwan's surrounding airspace, setting new records in operational tempo. Military exercises around the island have increased in both scale and frequency, including large-scale drills that simulate blockade scenarios. At the same time, the United States has responded by expanding military support, approving its largest arms package to Taiwan to date. Taiwan itself has moved to increase defense spending over the coming years, signaling that it is preparing for sustained pressure rather than a short-term crisis. Regional actors are also adjusting. Japan, historically constrained by a pacifist framework, is now openly debating the implications of a Taiwan contingency for its own security. Military assets are being positioned closer to the region, reducing response time and increasing readiness. And this is where the significance of Taiwan goes beyond territory. Taiwan is not just a geopolitical flashpoint, it is a central node in the global semiconductor supply chain. A disruption there does not stay in the region. It affects manufacturing, technology, and financial systems worldwide. So the question is not simply whether a conflict over Taiwan happens. The question is what happens to the global system if it does. Because if Taiwan becomes unstable, the balance of power in the Pacific shifts rapidly, and every country connected to that system is forced to recalculate its position. And when multiple recalculations happen at the same time, the system itself becomes unstable. People ask why all of this is happening at the same time, and the answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. For roughly 70 years, the global system has operated on a structure built after World War II, led by the United States, with the dollar at its center and military presence as its enforcement mechanism. It was not perfect, but it created a level of stability that most of the world adapted to. What is happening now is that system is being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. Russia is applying pressure in Eastern Europe. Iran is applying pressure in the Middle East. China is applying pressure in the Pacific. And at the same time, the United States itself is internally divided over how far it is willing to go to defend that system. Countries are responding to that uncertainty. NATO members are increasing defense spending, with more countries reaching or exceeding the 2% of GDP threshold than at any point since the guideline was established. Some countries are going far beyond that. Poland, for example, is committing a significantly larger share of its economy to military capability. Sweden, after maintaining neutrality for generations, has rapidly expanded its defense budget within a single year. These are not symbolic moves. They are structural adjustments. Countries do not accelerate military spending at this scale when they believe the system is stable. They do it when they are preparing for the possibility that it is not. So what happens next? Step by step. The first step has already occurred. Energy prices have surged. Oil has moved sharply higher. Natural gas has risen significantly, and fertilizer costs have followed. That pressure feeds directly into food systems, which leads to step 2, food insecurity. Even before the latest escalation, hundreds of millions of people were already experiencing food stress. Now, with disruptions in both the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, supply chains are being compressed from multiple directions at the same time. The system is not breaking yet, but it is tightening. Step 3 is regional expansion. As pressure increases, more actors are drawn in, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. Countries that depend heavily on energy imports cannot remain passive if supply routes become unstable. Step 4 is economic contagion. Financial systems are deeply interconnected, and instability in one region does not remain isolated. Capital flows adjust, assets are liquidated, markets react, and that reaction spreads across borders. Step 5 is the nuclear shadow. This is not about immediate use, but about the conditions that make miscalculation more likely. Multiple nuclear-armed states are now operating within overlapping zones of tension, while communication between them has deteriorated. And that combination capability without clear communication is where risk becomes most difficult to control. Here's the part most people misunderstand. Wars do not usually begin because everyone decided they wanted one. They begin because small events connect, escalate, and compound until there is no easy way to step back. The people managing these situations, diplomats, military leaders, governments, most of them are not trying to trigger a larger conflict. But once systems are set in motion, they do not always respond to intention. They respond to pressure. And as pressure increases, the available options begin to narrow. The margin for error becomes smaller, and at a certain point, events are no longer controlled by decision. They are driven by reaction. That is why the current moment matters. Not because something has already happened, but because of what is building. The most dangerous response right now is to ignore it, and the second most dangerous is to assume that someone else has full control of it. Watch the key points. Watch the pressure. Because what happens next will not be decided in a single moment. It will unfold step by step, and by the time it becomes obvious to everyone, the direction may already be set.